you were saying the Bridge of Remagen was the last impediment to the Allied forces. You could come across with the soldiers, but not with the tanks. And the ingenuity of the American engineers was to put what they called pontoon bridges for the tanks. And somehow they succeeded driving tanks on pontoon bridges, but not on the main bridge. But the soldiers came across on the main bridge, which is quite a story by itself. So when that happened, all of what they thought the fast-moving Rhine River, which is an extraordinary river, it comes out of at that time probably came out of it still does, comes out of the mountains and glaciers and all of that, cold and fast running. How would that be an impediment from your knowledge?
Frankly, I'm not a military expert, so I could not tell. The Rhine River is very long, and there were several armies that were involved in that part of the war. There was the French army, there was the British army.
It was Allied forces.
Allied forces coming from the west, and I think the Remagen Bridge was just one of many possibilities for this war to continue. I mean, the reason it was important, it was the only bridge that was not destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
But as you said, the engineers had developed pontoon bridges. The idea of building a bridge one way or another. The situation was so lopsided already.
Lopsided?
The Germans would not have been able to resist these invading armies.
Right. Well, while that was a remarkable event, of course, all the same while the Russians kept coming from the east. So the squeezing of the population.
There was even a discussion among the military leadership in Germany to hold off the Soviets, push everything east, and let the Americans invade, because Americans are kind of blonde and blue-eyed, so they were better.
Look like
I'm being facetious here, but
that's interesting.
Yeah. The Nazis knew, and the armed forces in Germany knew, that with the crimes against humanity they had committed in the East, they were much worse off than with what they had committed in the West.
So that was a balancing out the crimes. Interesting. So,
and indeed, Americans were much more lenient than the Red Army troops.
well, when Americans saw the Germans and their similarity to their own brethren, they thought, well, this guy looks like he could be from Indiana, or from Milwaukee, or from Chicago. Oh yeah, I got a cousin that looks a little bit like him, and he's a German, and he speaks perfect English. Wow, he must be a good German, or he's something else. And I had a good friend, Ferdinand Sperl, who was the guy that engineered the Lipizzaner horses, the rescue of them. It was in, I think, in Czechoslovakia. They had the Russians had located a chalet there, and he got a hold of the horses there and had to bring them from Czechoslovakia. Now, if you came from, I'm not sure what part of Czechoslovakia, but if you came from that area, where would you come to travel to bring those horses out of there? This was after the war was pretty well over, but not quite.
You mean where to take the horses?
Well, they were headed east, or headed west.
From Bohemia?
Right, from Bohemia. So they would have had to come through, from your knowledge.
You had to come through. If you go west, you have to go through Munich. If you go east, you go through Vienna.
So there's sort of the southern part of Germany and so forth.
Yes.
And so, with all this said, the hanging of the people for how many days, coming back to that point, is very punctuating thing that your great aunt told about. What was her response when she saw these hangings, and how did the people feel?
She was not directly confronted with this case.
She got to see
it. Just happened. No, it just happened a few villages from there.
Oh, it wasn't in her. She didn't get to witness it.
She did not get to witness it personally. No. So, I mean, the effect was clear. I mean, it was just sheer terror, and most people cowed to terror. There was no option. It did not seem to be an option.
I bet.
And this is, I mean, on a greater scale, this is what Berliners lived through. There was no surrender in Berlin. It was to the point where, as the German armies retreated, they holed up in the city, and there was a subway system in the city. And it was not just the armies that retreated into the city, it was hundreds of thousands of refugees, German refugees who were running from the Red Army. Many of them sought shelter in the subway. One of the last orders of the retreating German army was to flood the subway in order to avoid the Red Army troops from getting into the city through the tunnels. But there were hundreds of thousands of refugees in those tunnels. That was the terror that people had to experience
and couldn't avoid,
and could not avoid.
Mm-hmm. That's that story too. When the Civil War began in the United States, they hung blacks all over New York because blacks worked on the docks of New York, bales of cotton and so forth. They were not in the South at all, and people who wanted the South to stay in the South and slavery and so forth, they took it out on anybody that looked like they were pro anti-abolition. They were for slavery all the way. Their finances would be affected. So the people do very bizarre things when money gets down to them, and they have a choice of doing this or that. And when their own life is in peril, and the only safe place they can go in an urban city area situation is a subway, my lord.
So yeah, those were the stark choices that Germans were forced to face for the very first time. And some held up and took good decisions, others just
Unluck.
somehow tried to survive.
Mm-hmm. Just grinding it through. Now, your father on his travels out of the Alps for 150 miles or thereabouts, survived from living in the farms on the way, or trying to get through the cities, or how did that
This
work?
is my father, who was a quote-unquote volunteer for the German Navy in the last days of the war at age 16.
Last months?
The last months of the war, yes. He was sent to training in the Alps, and eventually his commanding officer sent the kids home. He threw away his uniform, put on civilian clothes, and tried to walk home. And this was one of his key experiences in his life. To see the destruction in the cities that he walked through.
And he was 18 at the time?
16.
Is it home?
16.
Only 16?
Smelling the death, seeing death, seeing the destruction is what really marked him. It was not the experience as a soldier or as a trainee, it was the experience of seeing the destruction that formed him for the rest of his life.
Now, he told you some of these stories?
He did, yes. I was lucky to grow up with a younger father who saw all this rather through the eyes of a not too participating witness. People who grew up with fathers who were older, who were in much more important positions within the army, within the state apparatus, preferred to not talk about it. Much of it also has to do with trauma. The stuff that German soldiers went through surviving is unspeakable. And that's also a big reason why the dinner table was very often not the place where children learned about what happened to
So you had to be alone with your father to learn that.
Or you learn about it after their passing, or whatever is left, letters, diaries, you name it.
I have had at the time relatives in Chicago. One was in the German army, and one in Germany. My uncle rode along with the officers in the military all the way to Moscow.
Mm-hmm.
And he told us different stories. And they both told about one thing they remembered, especially on the retreat. People don't know much about the retreat except that they couldn't get the Russians made an assault. Spring went to overnight winter, brutal winter from 50 degrees to about 20 below zero. Tanks froze in place, vehicles froze in place, nothing could move. But on the way back, the retreating armies got trapped on the roadways and got buried by tanks. And they would go along the roadway, and they'd see what looked like a dead tree in the middle of the road, black. And here it was hands reaching out of buried bodies in the earth from the tanks, spinning around these people trapped in a trench and things like that. He said they went into I guess in the eastern Russia, they have, in the farmlands, they have what are basically dirt walls, clay walls, covered in straw and so forth. And then they put a fire pit in the middle to keep the whole thing warm, radiating. And he and these officers went in. And the German priests that were right along with the military were not allowed to become officers. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
Yeah.
So you see, these are the stories I did not hear from my grandfather, who was battling on all fronts as a artillery officer from 1939 all the way through 1945.
Wow.
He volunteered even though he had 5 children, and he was a pastor. Mm-hmm. He must have felt compelled, family traditions of serving, to volunteer. And he wrote his wife almost daily letters. They exchanged. But there's not one single word about what he actually saw. Part of it has to do with the censorship. Soldiers were not supposed to say exactly where they are and what they see in their letters. But I mean, he was an educated man. He could have written down something afterwards, but he did not even want to talk.
My uncle told me these stories himself. I met him, I went to Germany and stayed with him for a 6-week period. But at the time, and so this particular incident, he talked about going into this, to stay in this overnight to get away from the cold and feed these people at the same time. And as they were inside this, with this stone furnace in the middle, and in this peripheral area to stay in, and sleep in, they noticed a stirring at the top of the fire pit. And it was like straw moving. And they looked up on top of it, and they found an old woman up there. And they said, well, she went there to die. These Russian people said, she's up there to die. And they said, you can't do that. No, you must take care of her. Well, he said, we have no food. She's willing to just finish out her life there. And so, in the language they could communicate on. So they took her down, cleaned her up, and they put her in a comfortable situation. She died within an hour. From probably the shock of that alone, of being in this near-death situation, being exposed to the comforts that was no longer there for her, and out of sheer necessity. So that this desperation people had on both sides of each circumstance just become huge and innumerable. We're coming to the end, I think, of this rather beautiful story, I believe, in many respects, probably wandering a bit back and forth, but the outcome of what people experience in a war at either end of a war is probably stated well as we could possibly do with our limited experience and knowledge. So, Johannes, I want to thank you.
Thank you, Augie, for keeping us on the edge.
You're more than welcome. I The edge is what takes you to a place where sometimes you need to be, to look and see what the horizon's all about, to see what's coming. If you can see ahead far enough to know what's coming, then you know you've been to the edge. Thank you very much. Thank you for watching. Thank you again, Johannes.
Thank you for having me.